Arab Spring or European-style discontent? Israel is the latest scene of nationwide mass protests. Thousands are taking part in rallies to demand the government provide cheaper housing and lower the cost of living. Well, the biggest protest yet, centered in Tel Aviv, is planned for Saturday night. Let's cross live now to Aziz Abu Sarah, a Palestinian-Israeli journalist, for more on this story. Thank you for joining us here on RT. Now, Israel has a low unemployment rate, GDP is growing, and economic performance is pretty good overall. So why are people protesting?
Well, you're right. Israel has a great economic accomplishments recently, but it doesn't really translate to the ground. Meaning that despite the high GDP, Egypt also had a high GDP. It had actually 5.1%. It still faced the protest. Israel is in similar situation. For example, 2/3 of the poor in Israel are working poor. People who are work every day, people who have great jobs and still are not able to go above the poverty level. So that's a reason that people are coming out to the street. I was listening yesterday to few people who were protesting, and there was a couple, for example, who both have great jobs. One is a graphic designer, one is a engineer, and they had one baby, and they can't make a living in Tel Aviv. So despite the growth in GDP, it doesn't really translate on the ground. The prices are incredibly high. The Israeli government had cut a lot of the social services. Not only this government, but actually recently few governments, both left and right, had cut social services but kept taxes very high, and that translated to reality on the ground that people cannot make a living anymore.
You mentioned Egypt there. Are these protests aimed to coincide with the revolutions we've seen in Arab states? Is there any connection at all?
Oh, absolutely there is a connection. I think the reality that people in Israel, just like everywhere else, saw that people, the actual people, can make a difference and can make a change is very important. If you look at the chants that people had in the last few days in Tel Aviv and other places, they were using the same rhythm, the same chants almost that in Egypt people use, such as the people want social justice. In Egypt it was the people want the end of the regime. In Palestine was people want the end of division. So you can see a lot of parallels. But also, if you look at how the protest has started, it's almost identical to how it started in Egypt and in Tunisia and other places. Started through Facebook, somebody who made a post on Facebook through social media. That's how people organize. It was organized completely in the beginning by the young people in Israel, students, people who feel that they have no future, people who feel who can't afford living here. So there's a lot of parallels and things that people in Israel, the young in Israel, are learning from the protests that happened in Egypt. And I think that's the key of why they are being successful at the moment.
Some might say these protests are a developing threat to Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think he realizes that this is a threat. He was supposed to be overseas this week, and he canceled his trips to a few countries overseas because he realizes the importance of what's happening. The big mistakes that Arab leaders had done is ignoring, such as Mubarak, is ignoring these protests and brushing them off as unimportant or not really realistic. Bibi is realizing, Netanyahu is realizing that this is not the way to go forward, and he's trying to figure out ways to deal with it, because a government could definitely fall in Israel on these ground, and I think he is in danger, especially that the protest is growing. Recently, 20%, his approval rating went down 20% in just 1 week. Over 80% of people in Israel are supportive of those protests. So these numbers are very scary to Bibi Netanyahu.
Now, Israel is continuing, of course, to focus on settlement building in the West Bank. Is there, or could there be, a connection between Israel's occupation there and these protests? Briefly.
Yes, absolutely. There is a strong connection. While Israel has been underbuilding in Tel Aviv and Haifa and all these major cities in Israel, Israel have been overbuilding in the West Bank. For example, 15%, according to Peace Now report, 15% of Israel public building budget have been going to building in the settlements in the West Bank, which only consists of 4% of Israel population. When you overspending 3-4 times more than the population need in the West Bank, while underspending in Israel proper, that tells you Israel's strategy, and that tells you that the focus of the Israeli government at the moment is more sustaining the occupation and more sustaining the settlements rather than caring for the majority of the population who actually oppose settlements and oppose occupation in Israel proper. So the problem here, though, is still many Israelis have not been able to make that connection. And the more and the sooner Israelis make that connection, realize that the occupation affects their daily life, affects the pennies that the government spending, the money that government spending in the West Bank versus in Israel, I think you will see a real revolution in Israel.
Okay, Aziz Abu Sarah, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you.